It was 2003, and I worked the late shift at Walmart. You know, the hours when the place feels more like a bizarre carnival than a store. The aisles were buzzing that night, packed with customers rummaging for deals or just passing time under the fluorescent lights. I was manning the electronics section, trying not to fall asleep on my feet, when the first scream cut through the air. "Where's my son? Where's Devon?" The sound of a mother's raw panic has a way of piercing through even the noisiest crowd. Everyone stopped. I turned to see a woman in her early 30s, frantic, her shopping cart abandoned as she clutched at random strangers, pleading for help. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "He's just 6 years old. Someone help me find him." The manager, a gruff guy named Carl, rushed over, trying to calm her down. "Ma'am, we'll find your son. He's probably just wandered into one of the aisles. Kids do that all the time." Carl rallied the employees, and we scattered like ants. We checked every corner of the store, from the toy section to the garden center. Customers joined in, shouting Devon's name, but the boy was nowhere to be found. After what felt like an eternity, Carl decided to check the security cameras. We crowded into the cramped office, the air thick with anxiety. The CCTV screens flickered, showing grainy footage of the store's aisles. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There was Devon, wearing a bright red hoodie, walking hand in hand with his mother. Then, just as she turned her back for a moment, he wandered off. We followed him on the monitors, watching as he strolled toward the bathrooms. He pushed open the door to the men's room and disappeared inside. "Did anyone check the bathrooms?" Carl barked. A few of us had, but we went again. We tore through every stall and checked under every sink. Nothing. It was like Devon had vanished into thin air. The police were called. When they arrived, they took over the cameras, rewinding and fast-forwarding the footage. Then, a man wearing a cheap-looking mask and carrying a large black briefcase entered the bathroom, not long after Devon. He stayed inside for a few minutes and then came out with the briefcase. He walked out of the store casually, blending in with the late-night crowd. The police zoomed in on his car as he left the parking lot. Luckily, the license plate was visible. We thought we'd caught a break, but it didn't last. The car was stolen, abandoned miles away near the edge of a forest. Officers combed through the woods with search dogs, but they didn't find anything. Days passed, and Devon's face was plastered on every lamppost, every news channel. People started talking about him, their voices tinged with fear. "Did you hear about that boy who went missing at Walmart? They say he's still out there somewhere." The store felt different after that, quieter. Customers avoided the bathroom like the plague. A week later, I was stocking shelves in the toy aisle when something clicked. A name surfaced in my mind like a bubble rising to the top. Matto. William Matto was a new hire, quiet and unassuming. He'd been working the same shift that night, but I hadn't seen him since. In fact, now that I think about it, I distinctly remember seeing him clock out early. I'd even waved goodbye as he walked toward the exit, right before the woman started screaming for her son. I couldn't shake the feeling. I told Carl, who immediately called the police. When they showed up, they asked for Matto's address, which was on file in the office. Matto lived alone in a rundown house at the edge of town, the kind of place with peeling paint and overgrown weeds that seemed to lean into the shadows. When the police arrived, the front door was locked from the outside. "Looks abandoned," one of the officers muttered. A sound came from inside the house, a dull thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. Everyone froze. "Police!" one of the officers shouted. "Open the door!" Silence, then another thud. The officers didn't wait. They broke down the door and stormed inside. What they found still gives me chills to this day. The house was a nightmare. The air was thick with a metallic smell, and the walls were covered in strange scratches, as if someone or something had been clawing at them. In the living room, Matto was crouched in a corner, his face pale and sweaty, muttering to himself. But that wasn't the worst part. In the basement, they found Devon. He was tied to a chair, his wrists and ankles bound with thick ropes. His face was streaked with tears, but he was alive. When the police untied him, he clung to one of the officers like his life depended on it. Matto was arrested on the spot. During questioning, he admitted to luring Devon into the bathroom and using the briefcase to smuggle him out of the store. The plan had been carefully calculated, but Matto panicked when the search began, hiding Devon in his basement instead of carrying out whatever twisted plans he'd had. Devon was reunited with his mother later that night. I'll never forget the look on her face when she hugged him, sobbing uncontrollably. The entire store felt like it could finally breathe again. As for Matto, I don't know what happened to him after that. Some people say he's still locked up, while others claim he vanished from prison. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. I worked at Walmart for about 2 years, and while I've got my fair share of stories, this one is burned into my mind. I'm writing this anonymously because even though it happened back in 2014, it still feels recent. At the time, I was just trying to get through my shifts, dealing with the usual chaos of the store. You've probably been in a Walmart around 2 p.m. on a weekday. It's packed like a mini Black Friday. I'd often be the only cashier for hours with no backup. People were impatient, yelling at their kids or chatting loudly on their phones, oblivious to the fact that I was scanning their items. The bag carousel was another nightmare, especially when people brought their totes. Imagine balancing a carousel while loading up groceries, a horrible design choice. But what happened that day wasn't about the usual stress or rude customers. It was something far more unsettling. It started like any other shift. I was at my register trying to keep up with the line of impatient customers. That's when I noticed him, a man. He wasn't in line, wasn't shopping. He was just staring, standing a few feet away, motionless, his eyes locked on me. At first I thought maybe he was waiting for someone or just lost in thought. But the way he stared, it wasn't normal. His face was blank, no emotion, no sign of recognition. And then he did something that made my stomach churn. He slowly raised his arm and pointed at me. Not at the register, not at someone behind me, at me. I froze. My hands hesitated over the scanner, and for a moment I forgot what I was doing. A customer cleared their throat, snapping me back to reality. I glanced back toward the man, but he was gone. I shook it off. Maybe he was just some weirdo. This was Walmart after all. You get all kinds. My shift ended around 10 p.m. The store was quieter now, the chaos reduced to a dull hum. I grabbed my bag, clocked out, and headed to the parking lot. As I approached my car, I noticed someone standing near the edge of the lot, just outside the glow of the overhead lights. It was him, the same man from earlier, the one who had pointed at me. I stopped mid-step, my heart racing. He was staring again, his face still unreadable. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a statue. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I needed to get out of there. As I unlocked my car, he started walking toward me, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if I should run or get in the car. Before I could decide, he stopped a few feet away and spoke in a low, chilling voice. "Be careful next time." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where he went. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the parking lot. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just a random creep. Someone messing with me. but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder during my shift, half expecting him to show up again. He didn't. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror. At first, it was just paranoia, but then I noticed a car that seemed to be following me. Every turn I made, every lane change, it stayed behind me. My chest tightened. It was him. I just knew it. I sped up, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The car sped up too. My mind raced. What did he want? Why was he doing this? I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I took a sharp turn into a residential area, hoping to lose him. When I glanced in the mirror again, the car was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I pulled into my driveway and stepped out of my car, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving. I spun around. His car was at the end of the street. He didn't stop, just drove past slowly, the headlights washing over me. I ran inside and locked the door. The next morning I went to the police. I told them everything, the store, the parking lot, the car that followed me. They listened, but I could tell they weren't taking it as seriously as I hoped. Still, they agreed to look into it and asked if the store had CCTV footage. I went back to Walmart and explained the situation to my manager. They weren't thrilled about getting involved, but eventually pulled the footage from the day before. There he was, clear as day, standing near my register, pointing at me. They also found footage of him in the parking lot, walking toward my car. The police reviewed the footage and said they'd do their best to identify him. But as the days turned into weeks, there were no updates, no arrests, nothing. I quit Walmart not long after that. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of constantly looking over my shoulder. Even now, years later, I still think about him. Who was he? What did he want? Why me? The police never found him. The case went cold, and I was left with more questions than answers. It happened last summer, and I still get chills thinking about it. It was a weekday, a little after 6 a.m. My husband needed something from Walmart, and since I was already awake, I decided to go with him. When we got there, he entered the store before me, and we naturally went our separate ways, each on a mission to grab what we needed. I wandered into the makeup aisle, casually browsing the nail polish. The store was quiet, almost eerily so, with only a handful of employees restocking shelves. That's when I noticed him. A middle-aged man walking behind me. His presence caught me off guard, and not just because it was odd to see a man in the beauty aisle at this hour. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was picking up cotton balls for his wife, or maybe he was just lost. But his behavior set my nerves on edge. He lingered in the aisle as long as I did, not grabbing anything, just hovering. When I left the aisle, he went too, keeping a subtle but noticeable distance. My heart rate picked up. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, pretending to glance at products, but never actually touching anything. It was too deliberate to be a coincidence. I moved to another aisle, hoping I was just being paranoid, but he followed me there too. Each time I turned down a different aisle, there he was, trailing behind me like a shadow. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he just a secret shopper? That would explain the constant surveillance. But why follow me so intently and avoid picking up any items? The only time he didn't follow me into an aisle was when a Walmart employee was there stocking shelves. Instead, he paced back and forth at the end of the aisle, like a predator waiting for its prey to step out of a safe zone. I lingered near the employee for as long as I could, pretending to examine a row of products I had no intention of buying. The man's pacing was erratic, his movements too rehearsed to feel natural. His eyes darted in my direction every few seconds. I told myself it was fine. I was in a public place, surrounded by cameras. What could he possibly do? But then I made a mistake. I decided to leave the safety of that aisle and head toward another section of the store, hoping to shake him off. As soon as I stepped out, I caught a glimpse of him in my peripheral vision. He was there, moving closer now, more determined than before. The air felt heavy, and my every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I couldn't be sure of his intentions, and I didn't want to overreact. But when I felt his eyes boring into me, I knew this wasn't just paranoia. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. Each aisle felt like a labyrinth, and I was trapped with him at every turn. My phone was in my pocket, but my hands were too shaky to grab it without him noticing. What would I even say? I couldn't call 911 for being followed in Walmart. My mind raced with every horror story I'd ever heard. People vanishing in broad daylight, the ways predators lure their targets into traps. And then a sudden turning point. I saw my husband. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. He was walking down an aisle ahead, holding a basket full of items. I hurried to him, my pulse pounding in my ears. The man must have seen me change direction because, as I reached my husband, he quickly turned and disappeared down a nearby aisle. "I think someone's following me," I blurted out, trying to sound calm, but my voice wavered. My husband raised an eyebrow and glanced over my shoulder, but the man was already gone. "It's probably a secret shopper," he said, brushing it off. "No," I insisted. "It's not that. He hasn't picked up anything, and he only follows me." When I stayed near the employee, he waited for me to leave. My husband frowned, but didn't seem overly concerned. We decided to grab the last of our items and head to the registers. I made a point to keep my husband close, refusing to let him out of my sight. For a brief moment, I thought the man had finally given up, but as we approached the cash registers, he reappeared. My heart sank. He was checking out at a different register, his eyes darting toward me as he spoke to the cashier. I hurried through self-checkout, practically dragging my husband along. We exited the store quickly, stepping into the cool morning air. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the silence made it feel even more isolated. As we approached our car, I glanced behind me. The man had exited the store and was walking toward a car parked 2 rows away. My stomach twisted into knots. Was he leaving, or was he waiting for me to let my guard down? I climbed into the car, locking the doors the moment I shut them. My husband started the engine, and I watched the man closely. He got into his car and pulled out of the parking lot. My eyes followed him as he drove straight onto the highway. I didn't breathe until his taillights disappeared into the distance. But just as I began to relax, something caught my eye in my side mirror. There was a figure standing in the far corner of the parking lot, partially obscured by the shadow of a lamppost. It wasn't him, or was it? My blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, watching. "Let's go," I whispered to my husband. He didn't notice my panic, assuming I was just shaken from the store incident. As we drove away, I kept my eyes glued to the mirror. The figure remained rooted in place until we turned out of the lot. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, and I'll never forget the eerie figure that seemed to materialize out of nowhere.